Hey, haven't done a video in a while. Um, so 12 days ago, President Biden, White House released the 2022 National Security Strategy, right? Released October 12th, 2022. So I'm just briefly go over this, um, and talk a little bit about what it is, what it means, my thoughts on it. Um, so what is it, right? Okay, it's a layman's easy terms. It is the commander in chief guidance to the entire federal government, all those entities, all those three-letter agencies, all the bureaucrats, the military, the State Department, the CIA, the FBI, all these guys, right, and all the secretariats. Um, you know, it's guidance, but it's not specified task. Um, but it's the commander in chief's description and visualization of the global environment and where he believes he and his staff, right? Because the president doesn't write this himself; his staff does. Um, but it's guidance, right? It's a visualization and a description to those agencies on where the president sees the United States and the near term way forward, right? So this helps the departments, the agencies establish priorities. All right, it's this vision of the strategic environment. It's the vision of the United States role in the strategic environment. All right, and the desired direction to address priorities in response to the environments. Okay, so the national security strategy, president level, right, White House, the high executive, is designed to feed the national defense strategy, all right, which is published by the Secretary of Defense every 4 years. So this national security strategy is not really going to feed into a national defense strategy because the latest one was published in March of 22, right? So 7 months ago, the SecDef published his national defense strategy. And that in turn should inform and influence the national military strategy, which is a document from the Joint Staff, right? So that's the Joint Staff's big document, right? And signed off by the chairman and Joint Chiefs. So the last one of those was 2018. So I would expect here soon to see a new national military strategy from the chairman. Obviously, the chairman doesn't do that himself, right? The joint staff, that's one of the things they exist to do, right? Is to work the national military strategy. So that's a little bit of the national security strategy, what it is, and how that trickle down feeds other strategic level guidance documents, right? So when it comes down to the end level, right? When you talk services, the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Space Force, the description of the priorities in the environment informs programs, structure, organization, doctrine, training, uh, all the stuff that affects the soldier, sailor, airman, marine, guardian, all right, um, coast guardsmen, right, when they're under a Title 10 authority, right? But this is what informs those things that affect those folks on a daily basis, right? Budget allocation, budget priority, new equipment fielding, new procurement, right? Are we gonna have Abrams X, or are we gonna have the M1A2 SEP V4, right? This all informs those decisions at the service level, right? So just my big overarching things I saw out of this, right? Um, and this is not a surprise from this White House, right? Big focus on NATO cooperation, um, re-establishing positive relationships with allies and partners, um, NATO, the European Union, and the Indo-Pacific Quad, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, right? So it's a this really throughout the document really pushes on um, cooperation and not going alone on anything, right? Um, Throughout here also talks a lot of food security and natural disaster awareness, right? Food security is a real thing, right? We don't feel it so much in the United States, right? 'Cause we don't have food insecurity in the United States. Um, not we don't have the Dust Bowl doesn't happen where in East Africa food insecurity is a real thing. In Southeast Asia, food insecurity is a real thing. On the Indian subcontinent, food insecurity is a real thing. And I really I would tie in there. It's not mentioned throughout the national security strategy, but to me, the greatest threat tied in with food security, natural disasters, is fresh water security, right? And that's something that's I didn't notice in the document, but to me, freshwater security is the most pressing issue on this planet, um, right? Is freshwater security. You don't realize how blessed you are in the United States and Western Europe, North America and Western Europe to have freshwater security. Um, that's not the case on most of this planet, right? So I really wish that would have been addressed more um, pointed, right? A lot of focus on China, more so than Russia. Russia is featured pretty heavily throughout the document, but a lot of focus on China because really, if anything, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, is Russia is not the threat, the military threat at even a tactical level, certainly not a strategic level that we once assumed Russia to be. But China is, right? Because China has those instruments of national power that they are able to leverage, certainly regionally, and to a large degree globally, right? So there's a lot of focus on People's Republic of China, um, their intent, their desire, and capability and capacity to shift the international order. Doesn't talk about the Russian war in Ukraine. Obviously, this has been going on since February 24th, right? So today is actually the 8-month anniversary of the beginning of that conflict. Um, and the national security strategy does recognize we are in an era of global competition. If you didn't know that, you need to pull your head out from under the rock. Right? So the first section is called the competition for what comes next. And really, this just shapes the rest of the document, right? Right. So the commander in chief's vision is protect the security of American people, expand economic prosperity and opportunity. Geez, and defend democratic values at the heart of the American way of life. Right. Let me move my head. So here's the strategic approach that is described in the national security strategy. Um, a little bit too much domestic policy focus. I don't really care about domestic policy. I don't think it's that important. That's me. I think foreign policy is incredibly important. Uh, domestic monetary policy is huge because the U.S. dollar is the world standard. Um, so I think monetary policy is a big deal. Domestic policy is quite irrelevant to me. So I think there's a little bit too much focus on domestic policy. It's up front in the document. As you continue along, it kind of wanes off. But the first two sections, a lot of domestic policy stuff. Um, so Commander in Chief wants to do this through alliances and partnerships. recognizes that China is the most consequential geopolitical challenge, while also mentioning and focusing on Russia, Iran, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea. Um, President does state in here he wants to avoid a purely strategic vision and wants to also recognize smaller scope issues, particularly in the Middle East, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere. That's good. I agree. I concur. Um, and I think we'll talk about those a little bit later in more detail. Recognize the effects of globalization 4.0, a widening inequality between the haves and the have-nots. Right, that is happening, and also inflation exacerbates that, and inflation is happening worldwide. Um, you're 8-9% here in the United States, 3% in Russia. Ukraine is experiencing about 30% inflation right now, right? So it varies everywhere you go. Um, Recognize that China is a trading partner and a competitor, right? Talk about technology transfer. That's a huge issue in any dealings with the People's Republic of China. There's a mention here in this first section of a desire to implement a global tax, and describes the desire to pay for infrastructure investment in low middle income nations, um, and also a desire to establish international standards rules for technology, cyber, trade, economics, and clean energy. Um, right. We've had stuff like this before, and we follow it. Some of our allies and partners half-heartedly follow it, and then our real competitors on the global market don't care. Right? They'll sign the agreement or whatever, and like whatever. We're still doing what we do. Um, Go back to alliances and partnerships. Desire to have a shared vision, common desire with like-minded states. Mentions the UN Charter. What is the UN anymore? Who knows? Other agreements, treaties, alliances, and the universal rights of individuals, right? Which I generally have no issue with. I don't focus so much on the United Nations as a having a shared vision with the United States, and the United Nations certainly not like-minded, especially as the Security Council is currently established. Um, with China and Russia having, some veto authority on there, it's quite irrelevant. Um, at least a great power competition, right? For smaller states, the UN can have a significant impact, right? But the UN largely has no impact on the United States, Russia, China, UK, France, Australia. Um, Section 2, investing in our strength, right? So first thing it talks about is national power, right? And when I think of national power, I think the dime, right? I don't think along these lines, but this is what was the White House used in this national security strategy, right? Modern industrial innovation strategy. Talks a lot about private sector open market economy and the desire to invigorate that, um, to help provide a secure infrastructure, a secure cyberspace, secure supply chains, and to mitigate technology transfer, particularly dual use technologies, right? So dual use technologies are technologies that are civil and military, right? Like a global positioning system, right? After once it was declassified in 1990s, is dual use, right? The military uses it, civilian sector uses GPS, right? There's other things like semiconductors can be dual use. Propulsion systems are dual use, can be, right? Cybersecurity systems, processes can be dual use, right? So the great concern there with the transfer of dual use technologies is China, right? Um, and I'll mention it here, and I'll try to remember to reinforce it later. But China's law states that it is Chinese companies are co-opted by the Communist Party, by the military, to transfer dual use technology, right? So if you're an American company or any foreign direct investment company in China, whoever you're partnered with in China, and you have to partner with someone, you can't go it on your own because Chinese law doesn't allow it. Whoever you're partnered with in China to bring your business, your services, your product is obligated by law to steal and try to find a military use for whatever you brought in to the Chinese economy, right? So your partners have to spy on you. It's the law. So that's one thing you have to just know. It's also why recently the Biden administration has significantly limited the ability for the world to conduct any business in semiconductors with China. It's particularly high-end semiconductors. Another thing, Americans are not allowed to work for those Chinese companies and help them develop the technology in China, right? So, that's one thing that the Biden administration done. I agree with is limiting China's capability to develop and transfer that technology, right? So that helps. Um, this second thing under national power it mentions people, um, focus on the workforce, STEM, particularly for women and girls, and continuing to figure out healthcare in the United States. I don't think we have a healthcare problem. Some people think we have a huge healthcare problem. I don't think it's that big a deal. It's a domestic thing, and like I said earlier, I don't care about domestic. Um, Workforce in the United States that is concerning because it is different, especially if we're looking at bringing some sectors that we have allowed to go offshore, and we're attempting to bring those back onshore, particularly in technology. Right, a lot of that stuff we outsourced or we moved production to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and even mainland China. Right, and now we need to bring it back, and it is important because it develops resiliency in the system. Right, if we have onshore, nearshore, offshore capabilities, that's a more resilient system than if we only have offshore, because that can be cut off easily. Or if we only have onshore because something can happen there, right? It's a single point of failure, right? So, I am for diversifying our workforce. I think it's a little bit more difficult to execute um, than just putting in a national security strategy and saying we're going to do this. Well, the president can't make it happen. Yeah, that's one thing about our system, right? The president can say, like, my vision is that we have this diverse, inclusive workforce, with women and girls and STEM jobs, and we bring semiconductor production onshore. Cool. He can't make it happen, right? It requires private investment and private desire to do that to a large degree, right? You could have some government in-house stuff that's probably military technology based, but yeah, I can't make AMD or Intel produce in the United States. I can't really. Uh, so interesting there. Um, Third pillar of national power in the NSS is democracy. I thought it really interesting, and I don't like this, the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. We don't have a domestic terrorism problem like this administration believes we do. Um, if you look for the boogeyman everywhere, you're going to find a boogeyman. Um, I don't think it's I think it's a waste of energy, personally. Are there bad people in the United States? Yes, you know, millions of them, right? Um, are they domestic terrorists? You know, we're throwing the terrorism word around way too easily and carelessly, um, and skewing the definition of the word terrorism. Right? I don't think it's terrorism. Right? You know, it's maybe criminal activity, not necessarily domestic terrorism. No, I'm not saying domestic terrorism doesn't exist. Timothy McVeigh, domestic terrorist, right? Unabomber, domestic terrorist, right? Jim Bob with flying his Confederate battle flag and drinking Bush Light, not a domestic terrorist. Might not be the guy you want to hang out with, but not a domestic terrorist, right? So I settle down on the rhetoric on domestic terrorism. Next section of investment, right? Diplomacy, right? This is consistent throughout the cooperation, alliances, partnerships, inclusive coalitions of the willing with like-minded views of democracy. Small section on military modernization. Every president puts this in there. We're going to modernize the military, right? We're still using, M16 based rifles. Um, you know, mid 1960s technology, right? We're still using Abrams tanks, which is at its core late 60s, early 1970s technology. Apache helicopters are late 1970s technology. Right. Bradley, mid 1970s technology. So we always say military modernization, and those fleets do have new things in them, right? Of some upgraded systems. But at its core, a B-52 is a B-52, and we haven't built a new B-52 airframe in nearly 60 years, right? But the B-52 is, one of the backbone systems of American nuclear deterrence. So, but we haven't built a new B-52 in 60 years, and we don't really have a plan to replace the buff, right? Um, so every president puts military modernization in there, right? And here President Biden says, our combat credibility equals deterrence. Well, and don't make no mistake, we do have a really good military. Um, and yes, it largely does deter the rest of the world from fooling around too much. Um, Nuclear deterrence remains a top priority. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some of the rhetoric that's come out of the Kremlin plays into that. This nuclear deterrence must remain a top priority. Along with that, on military modernization, you really got to talk about the nuclear triad and what are we doing to maintain. What's our strategic guidance to the services and to the functional combatant command of United States Strategic Command to maintain our nuclear capabilities at a, at a modern level of readiness. Uh, and I do like this last one, that's talked about in the NSS is the integrated deterrence. Right, we have to integrate our military strategy, operations, tactics, techniques, procedures, doctrine, procurement systems across domains. Right. So when I talk domains, I'm talking about air, land, sea, surface, subsurface, space, cyber, right? Those are domains, right? So we got to integrate all of our military capability across domains. Uh, we have to maintain integration across regions, all right? And that leads itself to our geographic combatant commands, right? Our CENTCOM, EUCOM, INDOPACOM, NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, whatever com I forgot. All right. the spectrum of conflict, right? From high-end combat, major theater combat operations to low-intensity operations, counterinsurgencies, counter-guerrilla, peacekeeping operations, stability operations, right? Integrate our capabilities across all the different kinds of military conflict we can find ourselves involved in. Integrated across the U.S. government, right? Um, and personally, we need to get integrated within our services first, right? Because we're not even integrated across, I spent 23 years in the United States Army. We are not integrated across our active duty Army, let alone integrated across the active guard and reserve components of the Army. Um, we have systems that don't talk to each other. Well, we don't have common weapon systems. We don't have common logistics networks and personnel systems. And there are issues within the services, let alone the issues that we have across the joint force, right? Um, so I'd like to see a little bit more focus on integrated deterrence and integrated across the U.S. government, right? Because ideally, like a soldier's a soldier, and should be able to communicate and operate within their service. All right, and that's not always the most simple task, just because we don't have the same systems across the active components, let alone across the reserve and the National Guard components. Which goes into with our allies and partners, right? We're a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In theory, we must maintain interoperability with NATO partners, right? And NATO partners must maintain, right? There's a NATO standard, right? Like ammunition, 5.56 by 45 ammunition is the NATO standard rifle ammunition. Well, now you got, we're talking about, well, maybe we need to have you know, a 6.5 millimeter rifle for the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. Well, it's not NATO standard, right? You just made us not integrated, not interoperable. As soon as you start talking about changing the calibers of our weapon systems without talking to our NATO partners and negotiating that across the alliance, because that is a treaty alliance, right? We signed a treaty with those countries in NATO. So we have to start at home in our own services and get those integrated, and then integrate across our services, right? So across our services, and then we need to start worrying about integrating with our allies and partners, because we're not even integrated with ourselves right now. So I wish the president would have put a little bit more focus and emphasis on integration and interoperability, because I think we suck at it. I think we're terrible. Um, it's not that people aren't trying, all right, to make interoperability happen. There are conflicting interests um, that keep us from being interoperable and integrated. So that's section 2. Section 3, global priorities. Um, Outcompeting China and constrain Russia. Right. So that's kind of a theme throughout. Recognize that China is an economic, diplomatic, military, and a technological power, and a very near peer competitor. Russia still has a imperialist foreign policy um, that is largely failing. So uh, my oldest kid just pulled in the driveway. Um, I think constraining Russia is less of a concern. Outcompeting China is a good focus. Um, I wish in the global priorities we'd also talk the real emergence of Iran, and what Iran means in the global commons, because the tides have turned over the past 8 months, where we have Iranian advisors embedded with Russian units in Ukraine. We have Iranian equipment, foreign military sales to Russia, and that equipment being used in Ukraine, which is a unique development that a lot of people have paid attention to Iran saw coming, right? But what this does for Iran is they're making money. They're making a lot of money really fast um, by exporting uh, foreign, military sales to Russia. So that's profit coming in to the Iranian regime that they're pumping right back into military technology and development systems. And we know Iran is they're dangerous they're dangerous competitor in the Middle East. All right, we have been at some level of a proxy war with Iran since 2004, right? As the United States, a little bit earlier, even really. I mean, you can take it back to the revolution in '79. Um, but Badr Corps, Jaish al-Mahdi in Iraq, right? The Houthis in Yemen, Hamas and Hezbollah in Israel, Lebanon, Syria, right? These are Iranian-backed proxies that we've been in conflict with, certainly for the past, 20 years, right? And Israel's been dealing with Iranian-backed proxies since 1948. So, um, the lack of talking about Iran as a global priority, I think it's something that needs to be addressed and relatively quickly, because Iran is quickly becoming a major player, certainly regionally a major player in the Middle East, but becoming a global player as well. Right? Let me move on to section 4 and talk strategy about region. Right? Indo-Pacific Center, 21st century geopolitics. The desire is to keep the Indo-Pacific free, open, and accessible, right? And of course, China is the major competitor there, as well as we talk Indo, right? The Indian subcontinent. So whatever, 40%, just China and India is like 40% of the world's population. Um, but free, open, and accessible, that's a competition, right? Especially talk South China Sea. I'm working some stuff on that on the side. Um, Working a paper on that and trying to link it to business, right? But right now, the South China Sea is contested, right? It's contested. It's China, it's Vietnam, it's Indonesia, it's the Philippines, right? There are multiple players in the South China Sea who are claiming it, uh, and when they claim it, and they claim an island mass, and they claim the territorial waters around that island, right? It's not open and it's not accessible waters to the international community anymore, right? So, and 40-50% of the world's trade moves through the South China Sea, right? It comes, for the most part, there it comes down in the Indian Ocean, comes across and moves up Middle East, Africa, and into Europe. So it's incredibly important piece of water. And it is absolutely something we have to focus on and think about and be a part of the negotiation as a partner, not necessarily as the benefactor in that specific region, right? But the Pacific at large, obviously, 70% um, of the world's land mass is the Indo-Pacific, the Earth's surface, I should say, is Indo-Pacific. And that's a long coast of the United States, from Alaska all the way down to San Diego and the Mexican border. Europe, really, the focus here is on deepening alliances, particularly NATO. A little bit mentioned the European Union, but the focus is really on NATO. Uh, I thought this was interesting. We start talking Western Hemisphere, $1.9 billion in annual trade. happens between the United States and other Western Hemisphere nations. That's a lot. I'd never imagined that number was that high. Um, but obviously there's some significant problems, um, mostly in Central America. Venezuela is a disaster. Um, but there's some good models to look at. Colombia is not uh, a train wreck anymore. Colombia is fairly stable, right? So some things have happened um, there, and there's some level of stability. But you look in the Caribbean, there's a lot of instability in the Caribbean as well. What are we going to do with Haiti? What is the status there? And can it stop getting hit by hurricanes and completely destroying any progress that was made? Um, but the Western Hemisphere does need to be a focus because that's our backyard, right? That's our hood, um, and that's Monroe Doctrine. If you want to take it back to some of the earliest times of this nation's existence. Middle East focus here was really on de-escalation, not as much, not and I would prefer more focused discussion on Iran as a regional competitor um, in the Middle East, and as being that counterpoint to our desire to de-escalate in the region, right? Because everything Iran does and continues to do is escalating. I don't like the nuclear deal with Iran. I don't think we need to cut some nuclear deal with Iran because I don't think they're going to follow it. That's what bad guys don't follow the agreements, right? He's got his fingers crossed behind his back while he's signing your nuclear agreement, right? And meanwhile, he's still, shuttling guns and surface-to-air missiles to Yemen to Houthis, and then they're turn around shooting it right at Saudi Arabia and UAE, right? And you wonder why Saudi Arabia is not happy with us right now, and is cutting oil exports to the United States. It's because we're cozying up to Iran on this nuclear deal, while they're continuing to supply arms to the Houthis, who take those arms and shoot them right at Saudi Arabia, right? And we've created an environment that this is happening, and we've kind of turned a blind eye to it as a partner, as a partner in the Middle East, right? And I'm not saying Saudi Arabia is good guys, right? Saudi Arabia has some significant moral and ethical issues that are counter to American values. Um, but if we want a partner in Saudi Arabia, particularly an energy partner, we've really offended them in how we've handled Iran over the past 2 years, and how we've enabled Iran to ramp up support of their proxy, uh, who continues to attack Saudi Arabia. Um, Similarly, like Israel not happy with us right now either for the same reason, right? Because it emboldens Iranian support of Hamas and Hezbollah, right? And Israel's really tired of rockets landing on them. So I I think the Middle East strategy is underwhelming. Uh, I want a lot more Iran. Yeah, I'd say 20 years ago when George Bush said, the axis of evil, I didn't buy into it. Um, but now I'm on the Iran kick right now. They're bad guys. Um, and they know how to play their hand in the Middle East very well. Um, be interesting to see what happens with all the internal politics of Iran right now as well. Um, is change possible? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There are protests, there are insurrection all over Iran, to include the regions that have always been in support of, uh, the religious authoritarian regime. Now, even those are in protest. you know. So, how do they handle that? How's the Iranian government handle it? Um, if there is an overthrow of the government, what happens? What's the security of nuclear materials, chemical materials, weapons, everything else? How secure is that? And, does toppling the Iranian regime actually make a more dangerous region? Uh, right? These questions we don't necessarily know the answers to right now. I'll move on to Africa. I've spent time in Africa, in East Africa, so I don't claim to be an Africa expert. It's a continent. It's not a country. Um, so I'm pretty well versed on Somalia and Kenya, uh, Djibouti, South Sudan. Right, that's kind of area I had a little bit of expertise in, but I'm not an expert. I've got experience, I should say. Right. So the NSS talks about desire to increase prosperity, private sector investment in and on the African continent. Um, the problem we have in Africa is we're late. The United States is late to the party, and this isn't really discussed in the strategy. Is China's been there and they've been invested for a while, and they're way ahead of us, and they've made inroads through the Belt and Road Initiative, through their African Partnership Initiative. Um, I was on a flight from Istanbul to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Boeing 737 Dreamliner, some pretty big aircraft, a lot of seats. I was the only white guy on the plane from Istanbul to Addis. I'm the only white guy on the plane, but there weren't any black people on the plane either. Right, so there were no Africans flying in Africa. It was me, and everyone else on the plane was Chinese. And that just it opened my eyes and blew my mind, and made me like really focus on what China's doing in Africa, right? And they're heavily investing, and they're also exporting their population to Africa, because those guys were lower class men. There were no women; they were only men, aged 25 to 50, um, and laborers, right? Um, so a lower economic class, and they're going there to work. They're going there to build Chinese procured infrastructure in Ethiopia. Uh, and I'm certain they're doing it in other countries. They're doing it in Djibouti. I've seen Chinese in Mogadishu. They're there as well. They're in Kenya, Tanzania. So they're everywhere across the continent, and in large numbers. Um, and what's interesting, like United States, if we do a project, like we're going to build a hospital or roads or freshwater wells project, we don't take a bunch of people from the United States, put them on a plane, and fly them there and build it. We send a couple liaisons, maybe a contract manager who goes in there, and locals could do the work, right? So it's a more of an investment. Um, but China exports their own labor to do it, right? So it's not even producing jobs in the local economy. It's producing jobs for Chinese laborers to execute. So there's a lot of opportunity in Africa. We are very late. We're very late to the game. Um, China's in there, but I'll tell you, a lot of African nations are not happy with China and how China is conducting themselves. So, on the flip side, there may be some opportunity to come in there and you know supplant China as the lead in some of those nations. I think particularly Ethiopia. They're really tired of China, because China made promises and then renegotiated, um, on what they were going to do, and Ethiopia didn't get a vote. on the renegotiated agreement that was dictated. So I think there's some opportunity in Africa that we're not really getting on. Arctic, maintain a peaceful Arctic. There's no really significant talk of climate change, reduce polar cap. We know the Arctic is starting to be contested. Um, so again, and I spent 3 years in Alaska. Um, so it was a little bit more of an intimate problem with me when I was in Alaska and I'm looking at the Arctic, right? um, but pretty short, pretty sweet. And the design, this the guidance is maintain a peaceful Arctic. Okay. The last one, sea, air, and space. I like maintain position as a world leader in space exploration. I'd prefer a little bit more guidance on how we need to do that. Is it NASA or is it contracting through SpaceX or Virgin Galaxy or Galactic or whatever, right? So how are we going to maintain this position as a world leader in space exploration? I'd like to get a little bit more vision from our commander in chief how to do that. Last two, freedom of overflight, freedom of navigation. I mentioned freedom of navigation, particularly in Indochina. It is an issue. Freedom of overflight issue some places. Sometimes you just have to coordinate and work the back channels a little bit more. But that's desired end states. Freedom of overflight, freedom of navigation, and maintain being the leader in space. And I think we're pretty effective at that. Um, but I would like to a little bit more guidance, really, to NASA on where the president envisions or what envisions NASA's role. Uh, Conclusion, just a little paragraph, 2 paragraph conclusion of national security strategy. I think I hit the main points I want to talk about. Some of the issues that I had with the national security strategy, some things that I think would be good to add or include, or you know, redefine the focus. Um, um, Overall, pretty good document. Not a significant diversion from any previous NSS I've read from any other administration. Um, like I said, the domestic stuff, cool. But every president's going to have his own domestic policy, and right, that's how you get votes. I get it, right? International strategic guidance doesn't get you reelected. Domestic policy largely is what gets you reelected. So I get it. Include that stuff in there. Make your voting bloc happy. But it's the domestic stuff in here. I think is of little value to national security. Um, you know, big focus on China. Little talk of Russia. Not enough Iran. And I think Iran's going to become a bigger issue as we go on through this decade. Um, and we just have to some degree we just have to wait and see what's happening inside Iran, right? Like what do these protests? How do they manifest themselves? Does it manifest itself in regime change, or does the regime, you know, tramp down and take care of these protests? You know, we'll see. Um, but Iran is continuing to export their military capability. Uh, the Revolutionary Guard Corps is still a thorn in the side throughout the region. Right, we've seen IRGC advisors in Ukraine embedded with Russian units. Right, it's the opposite of how stuff was 40 years ago, where the Russians were embedded with the Iranians, coaching, teaching, and mentoring them. Now Iran's coaching, teaching, mentoring Russia, right? Because Iran has more relevant combat experience doing this in Iraq, in Yemen, and Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, right? So the IRGC advisors are well trained and well experienced, um, and they're also bringing modern Iranian hardware to Russia to employ on the battlefield. All right, so we're seeing a lot of Iranian equipment on the battlefield. I think we're going to continue to see more Iranian equipment and different types now. We've seen unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, kamikaze drones of Iranian production. You know, I think it's a matter of time before you start seeing Iranian artillery, rocket artillery, cannon artillery, rocket artillery, missiles, surface air missiles that try to bring some parity back to the fight on behalf of Russia. Um, but the money that's coming into Iran from this, because this ain't free, this ain't pro bono, is that's going to be a capital investment in Iran's military, industrial development technology programs that's going to make them better, right? Is make their material solutions are going to be better and higher quality, and they're going to have more of them because they do have the capital investment coming in. They're making the capital investment. So we'll see really how it plays out over the next half of the Biden administration, um, and really how this plays out, right? Because it's all interconnected. It's not, in the conclusion here, I just have the regions and some domains that the president focused on, but the Middle East touches everything, right? And don't for a second think that Iran want to export IRGC advisors and equipment to the Western Hemisphere if it thinks that will help further their strategic goals. Um, you know, but right now, Iran is doing it. China's doing it. China's in Africa. China's all over the Indo-Pacific. Um, Europe and American economies are closely tied to China. Um, so it's all linked, right? There's I don't think there's an axis of evil. I think there is a web of interconnected economies, nations, people, and ideologies that have really made this planet a lot more complex than it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? And that's what the national security strategy is trying to address is the complexity of the problem set that we're faced with every day. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and kill this because I'm about 53 minutes of blabbering on, just running my yap. So uh, hope it's useful. If not, no refunds. All right. But have a great week and talk to you later.